By the time Officer Caleb Mercer asked Darius Monroe to step away from his own tools, something important had already changed. A report about an unfamiliar man had begun turning into an investigation of a crime nobody had confirmed. Early that evening in Milwaukee, 32-year-old Darius stepped out of the garage of a house under renovation carrying the electrical tester he had accidentally left behind after finishing his work. Still dressed in his slate blue work shirt and dark work pants, Darius looked exactly like what he was, an electrician finishing a job. His work van sat only a few yards away, loaded with the equipment he used every day. To Darius, there was nothing unusual about the scene. He had been hired to work there, had finished for the evening, and had simply returned for one forgotten tool. But a neighbor who did not recognize him saw a black man coming out of the garage carrying equipment toward a van and called police to report what he considered suspicious activity. Officer Caleb Mercer arrived a short time later. At 41, Caleb was a broad, gym-fit white patrol officer with light brown hair cut in a high-and-tight style. His full uniform, duty belt, and body camera made the imbalance of authority immediately clear. Caleb approached while Darius was preparing to put the tester into the van. "Sir, hold up for me." Darius stopped. "Is there a problem?" Caleb asked what he was doing at the house. "Electrical work," Darius said. "I'm the electrician. I came back for a tester I left in the garage." Caleb's eyes moved from Darius to the tool, then toward the open garage. "Do you live here?" "No. The homeowner hired me." Caleb asked for identification. Darius did not argue. He reached slowly for his wallet, handed over his driver's license, and explained that the homeowner could confirm everything. The interaction could still have remained a simple verification. Instead, Caleb looked at the equipment near the van and asked, "Can you prove you're authorized to remove that property from the garage?" Darius glanced at the tester in his hand. "This is my equipment." Caleb's expression stayed controlled. "Set it down for me." Darius paused for half a second, more surprised than defiant, then placed the tester on the driveway. "Fine." Caleb instructed him to turn slightly away from the garage and keep his hands visible. Darius complied, but his confusion hardened into caution. His work van was beside them. His tools were visible inside it. He had given Caleb his name, his occupation, and the simplest possible way to verify why he was there. Yet the questions no longer sounded like an officer trying to identify someone. They sounded as though Darius had already become the explanation for a crime nobody had established. "Am I being detained?" Darius asked. Caleb said he was investigating a possible property crime and needed Darius to remain where he was while he sorted out what had happened. Darius looked toward the house, then back at Caleb. He knew irritation would not help him, so he kept his voice measured. "The homeowner can verify I was working here. My work order is in the van." Caleb did not accuse him of burglary outright, but he did not release him to retrieve the paperwork either. That distinction mattered to Darius. Someone had apparently seen something. Caleb had a legitimate reason to ask questions. What Darius could not understand was how quickly those questions had moved from who he was to whether the tools he carried actually belonged to him. He looked at the company van sitting only a few yards away, then at the officer standing between him and it. "Officer," Darius said, "what exactly did they tell you I stole?" Caleb did not name a single item. Darius kept his hands visible and waited for Caleb to answer. Instead of naming anything that had supposedly been stolen, Caleb said, "I am trying to determine what happened here." Darius nodded once. "Then tell me what you are investigating. Did somebody report a burglary, or did somebody report seeing a person they did not recognize?" The distinction was simple, and Darius wanted it stated clearly. Caleb told him the call involved suspicious activity around the property and that he was investigating the possibility of a burglary. "Did the caller say they saw me break into the house?" Darius asked. "I am not going to debate the call with you. I am not asking for a debate. Did anyone report property missing?" Caleb did not answer that question directly either. He told Darius to remain where he was while he contacted dispatch. Darius looked toward his van. "My work order is inside. It has this address on it. You can also call the homeowner. Either one clears this up." Caleb said Darius would not be permitted to reach into the van until he knew more about the situation. That restriction made sense to Darius from an officer safety standpoint, even if he disliked being detained. What bothered him was what came next. Caleb glanced through the open side area of the work van, where several pieces of professional electrical equipment were visible, and asked whether Darius had documentation showing the equipment belonged to him. Darius stared at him for a moment. "You are asking me to prove I own my own tools before anyone has even said tools were stolen." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "I am asking questions, and I am answering them. I gave you my identification. I told you why I am here. I gave you 2 ways to verify it." Darius stopped there. He could feel his frustration rising, and he did not want frustration mistaken for something else. Instead, he asked, "Am I being detained because someone reported an actual crime?" Caleb replied that Darius was being temporarily detained while he investigated the circumstances. Darius nodded. "Then please verify the homeowner." Caleb stepped several feet away and contacted dispatch. Darius remained beside the driveway, watching the officer rather than the house. The imbalance between them had not disappeared, but something had changed. Darius was no longer trying to persuade Caleb that he was a respectable person. He was asking Caleb to identify the facts supporting the detention. A moment later, dispatch provided the first useful clarification. The caller was a neighbor. The caller did not know Darius, did not know whether Darius worked at the property, and did not appear to have spoken with the homeowner before making the report. Caleb asked whether there was any additional information. There was no confirmed report of missing property in the information available at that point. Darius heard enough of the exchange to understand what had changed. The call might justify an officer coming to ask questions, but the person who made it had no direct knowledge that a crime had occurred. Caleb returned his attention to Darius. "I still need to sort this out." Darius stayed where Caleb had told him to stand. "Then verify it before this goes any further." Caleb told him to stay where he was while the investigation continued. Darius did not argue further. He looked directly at the body camera mounted on Caleb's uniform and spoke calmly enough that there could be no confusion about what he was requesting. "I want it recorded that I asked you to verify the homeowner before you search anything." Caleb acknowledged the statement, but he did not end the detention. The information supporting the original suspicion had just become weaker. Caleb's decision was to keep going. Caleb looked toward the work van again. "I would like to take a look inside." Darius understood immediately what that meant. "I do not consent to a search of my van." He kept his voice even. "You can verify the job without searching it." Caleb told him not to move while he continued checking the circumstances. Darius stayed beside the driveway with his hands visible. The simplest solution remained the same: contact the homeowner. After another exchange with dispatch, Caleb told Darius he could use his phone to make that call, but instructed him to move slowly. "My phone is in my shirt pocket," Darius said. Caleb nodded for him to proceed carefully. Darius began reaching toward it, but as his fingers neared the pocket, Caleb appeared to reconsider allowing the movement. "Stop. Hand away from the pocket." Darius halted with his arm partly raised. "I am getting the phone you told me to use." "Hand away. Now." Darius started pulling his hand back, but Caleb read the changing movement as continued access to the pocket rather than withdrawal. The decision came in seconds. Caleb drew his taser and deployed it. The contact was brief. Darius went down on the driveway, stunned and disoriented but conscious. Caleb moved in, secured Darius's hands behind his back, and placed him in handcuffs while repeating instructions for him to remain still. There was no crowd gathering around them and no dramatic confrontation. For Darius, the shock came from how quickly a request to make a phone call had become a use-of-force incident. "I told you what I was reaching for," he said once he could speak steadily. Caleb answered that Darius had failed to follow a command during an uncertain situation. Darius did not argue from the ground. The body camera had captured the exchange, and he knew repeating himself would not change what had just happened. Then Caleb's radio sounded. Dispatch had completed the homeowner verification Caleb had requested earlier. Caleb listened. The homeowner confirmed Darius Monroe's name, confirmed that Darius was the residential electrician hired to work at that exact address, and confirmed that he had been working in the garage that day. The electrical equipment Darius had been carrying was consistent with the work he had been hired to perform. More importantly, the homeowner had reported no burglary and no missing property. Caleb's expression changed. The certainty that had guided the encounter was gone, replaced by the realization that the central question about Darius's presence had just been answered. Darius was not an intruder who had invented a convenient explanation after being stopped. He was exactly who he had said he was from the beginning. Caleb remained responsible for controlling the scene and completing the required steps after using force, but the informational balance had reversed. The man in handcuffs was now a verified worker with a legitimate reason to be there, while the officer who had detained him would have to account for the decisions made before that verification arrived. Darius drew a slow breath and looked toward the van. The work order he had offered to show Caleb was still inside, exactly where he had said it was. Caleb contacted dispatch again and requested a supervisor and medical evaluation following the use of the taser. He no longer spoke about Darius as a possible burglar. The original suspicion had been answered, but its answer created a more consequential question. What information had Caleb actually possessed when he decided the situation required force? Caleb did not try to preserve the burglary theory after the homeowner's confirmation. He helped Darius sit upright, checked that he was responsive, and removed the handcuffs once the scene was secure and there was no longer a basis to keep him restrained. Medical personnel are on the way, Caleb said. Darius rubbed his wrists and remained seated on the edge of the driveway. He was angry, but the anger had changed. He no longer needed to convince Caleb that he belonged at the house. That question had been settled. Now he wanted an accurate record of how the encounter had reached this point. Caleb explained that he had reacted to Darius reaching toward his shirt pocket after being told to keep his hands visible. Darius looked at him. "You told me I could call the homeowner. I told you to move slowly. And I told you where my phone was." Caleb did not deny that. "I perceived the movement as a potential threat in an uncertain situation." Darius could have argued about every second, but he stopped himself. The body camera had recorded the exchange. What mattered now was preserving the facts rather than winning an argument beside the garage. A patrol supervisor arrived several minutes later, followed by medical personnel. Darius agreed to be evaluated. He was shaken and uncomfortable, but he remained alert and answered their questions clearly. While the evaluation continued, the supervisor spoke separately with Caleb and began documenting the use of force. Caleb described responding to what he had understood as a possible burglary involving a man leaving a garage with property. The supervisor listened, then contacted dispatch to clarify the original call classification. "Was this entered as a burglary call?" the supervisor asked. The answer came back clearly. No. The incident had been classified as suspicious activity. The distinction did not prove by itself that Caleb had acted improperly. Officers could investigate circumstances that developed beyond an initial call classification, but it changed what needed to be examined. The question was no longer whether Darius had been authorized to work at the property. He had been. The question was how an uncertain report had developed into a burglary suspicion strong enough to support an increasingly restrictive encounter. Darius heard enough of the exchange to understand that the direction of scrutiny had shifted. Less than an hour earlier, Caleb had been asking him to account for his presence, his tools, and his work van. Now a supervisor was asking Caleb to account for the information behind his decisions. Darius did not treat that shift as a victory. He asked the supervisor for the incident number, the process for obtaining records, and the procedure for filing a formal complaint. The supervisor gave him the information and explained that the use of force would be documented and reviewed under department procedure. Darius also asked that the dispatch record and body camera footage be preserved. Caleb remained nearby, quieter now. He did not apologize, but neither did he continue insisting that Darius had somehow created the entire situation. His position had shifted toward explaining his decisions rather than defending the original suspicion as fact. When the medical evaluation was complete, Darius stood slowly and looked toward his van. The tester was still on the driveway where Caleb had ordered him to place it. He picked it up only after confirming that he was free to leave. Before getting into the van, Darius made one more decision. He was not going to let the incident disappear into competing memories of what each man thought had happened. He wrote down the incident number, saved the supervisor's information, and decided that the next morning he would file the complaint and formally request preservation of the dispatch audio and body camera record. The next morning, Darius sat in his work van outside his first scheduled job and stared at the incident number he had written down the night before. Part of him wanted to put the entire encounter behind him. He had customers waiting, invoices to finish, and electrical work that would not complete itself. Filing a complaint meant giving another statement, answering more questions, and returning mentally to a driveway he would rather forget. His pride told him to move on. Then he remembered how many chances there had been to verify the truth before the encounter escalated. Darius submitted the formal complaint. He described the sequence without exaggeration. Why he had been at the Milwaukee renovation property, what he had told Caleb, the verification he had requested, the questions about his tools, the detention, the attempt to contact the homeowner, and the use of the taser. He also formally requested that the dispatch audio and body camera footage be preserved. The complaint triggered a review of the records associated with the incident. Investigators already knew the homeowner had confirmed Darius was the electrician hired for the property. Now they examined a different question. What had the police actually been told before Caleb arrived? The original call provided the answer. The neighbor had reported seeing a man he did not recognize coming out of a garage carrying tools toward a van. He thought the situation looked suspicious. He had not reported seeing a door forced open. He had not reported seeing Darius break into the house. He had not said any property was known to be stolen. He had not reported a weapon, a threat, or a homeowner asking for help. During the call, the dispatcher had asked whether the man might be working at the property. The neighbor's answer was simple. He did not know. That detail mattered because uncertainty had been present from the beginning. The caller had described something he did not understand, not a crime he had witnessed. When Darius learned what the original recording contained, his anger settled into something more precise. He had assumed the neighbor must have described a burglary strongly enough to explain why Caleb approached him with that possibility already in mind. The record showed otherwise. The neighbor's suspicion had justified checking what was happening. It had not supplied the facts that later made Darius appear to be a burglar. For the investigator reviewing the case, this did not automatically settle whether Caleb's conduct violated policy. Police officers were expected to evaluate circumstances for themselves, and information could develop after a call was dispatched. But it established a firm starting point against which every later decision could be measured. Darius had already been verified as an authorized worker. Now the source information was verified too. Two major factual questions had answers, and neither supported the idea that police had received a confirmed burglary report. The focus therefore moved away from what the neighbor might have meant and toward what Caleb himself had learned, inferred, and decided during the encounter. Investigators preserved the dispatch timestamps, radio traffic, and body camera recording, then began placing them on a single timeline. The next task was no longer to discover another version of the story. It was to reconstruct, minute by minute, exactly what Caleb knew before he deployed the taser. The timeline changed the review from a disagreement about impressions into an examination of decisions. Investigators aligned the dispatch record with Caleb's body camera footage and radio traffic, then followed the encounter in the order Caleb had experienced it. When he arrived, he knew a neighbor had reported an unfamiliar man leaving a garage with tools. That information gave him a reason to investigate. It did not tell him a burglary had occurred. Within the first minutes, Darius identified himself, explained that he was a residential electrician, pointed out his work van, and offered two ways to verify his presence: the work order inside the van and direct contact with the homeowner. Caleb had not been required to accept that explanation without checking it. The more important question was whether his assessment changed as additional information arrived. Dispatch had informed him that the caller did not know Darius, did not know whether he worked at the property, and had no confirmed report of missing property. Those facts weakened the burglary assumption before the encounter reached its most consequential moment. The body camera footage also showed something important for Darius. He had not remained perfectly motionless. After Caleb allowed him to use his phone to contact the homeowner, Darius said the phone was in his shirt pocket and reached toward it. Caleb ordered him to stop. Darius froze, explained what he was doing, then began withdrawing his hand from the area of the pocket. The movement was real, and investigators did not erase it simply because the homeowner later verified his story. When Darius was asked about that moment, he did not pretend otherwise. "I was reaching for my phone," he said. "I thought I had permission to call the homeowner. When he told me to stop, I was trying to pull my hand back." That admission mattered because the review was not supposed to manufacture a flawless victim and an irrational officer. Caleb had been responsible for making a rapid judgment about movement during a detention. But that judgment had not occurred in isolation. By then, Darius had repeatedly offered verification, The caller's direct knowledge had been shown to be limited, no missing property had been confirmed, and Caleb had authorized the very phone call Darius was attempting to make. Investigators therefore examined the entire decision chain rather than treating the final movement as if nothing had happened before it. Seen in sequence, the encounter looked different. Caleb had arrived with an unanswered question, but each uncertain detail had been read in the same direction. The tools became possible stolen property. The garage became a possible burglary scene. Refusing a van search did nothing to reduce Caleb's suspicion. By the time Darius reached toward the pocket where he had already said his phone was located, Caleb was no longer reacting to that movement alone. He was reacting to everything he had already come to believe about the man making it. None of those facts alone answered the policy question. Together, however, they gave the review something it had not possessed at the beginning: a complete causal sequence. Darius understood that this was more complicated than proving Caleb had lied. Caleb had encountered an uncertain situation and made a series of judgments. The issue was whether he had continued treating uncertainty as evidence after information began pointing the other way. With the factual record complete, investigators no longer needed another witness, another recording, or another revelation. They had reached the question the department itself now had to answer: whether Caleb's continued escalation, culminating in the use of the taser, had remained within policy once the information available to him was considered as a whole. The evidence-gathering phase was over. The case moved to an administrative finding. The administrative finding did not say Caleb had been wrong to approach Darius. The neighbor's call had given him a legitimate reason to investigate an unfamiliar person leaving a garage with tools. The failure came later. The review concluded that Caleb had not adequately adjusted his assessment as the facts changed. Darius had identified himself, offered a work order, provided a direct route to homeowner verification, and remained available for questioning. Dispatch had established that the caller did not know whether Darius worked at the property and had not reported confirmed missing property. Caleb was also aware that no burglary had been verified, yet his decisions continued to develop around the assumption that Darius might be involved in a property crime. The review paid particular attention to the final seconds before the taser was deployed. It accepted that Darius had moved toward his shirt pocket and that officers sometimes had to react quickly to uncertain movements. But the finding did not evaluate those seconds in isolation. Caleb had authorized Darius to use his phone to contact the homeowner. Darius had stated where the phone was located. The movement occurred after several pieces of information had already weakened the original suspicion. Taken as a whole, the department concluded that Caleb's continued escalation and use of force did not meet its expectations for de-escalation and proportional response under the circumstances documented in the record. The finding drew a line Darius had been waiting for someone to draw. Caleb had been justified in approaching the property and asking questions. What he had not been justified in doing was allowing that initial suspicion to govern the encounter after the facts began pointing elsewhere. Caleb had not received a burglary report and then acted on it. He had received an uncertain report, formed a more serious interpretation, and continued making decisions through that interpretation even as information accumulated against it. The department issued a disciplinary finding and removed Caleb from street patrol pending the remaining administrative disposition. There was no public spectacle and no instant termination. His badge was not dramatically taken from him in front of Darius. The consequence came through the same institutional process that had reconstructed the encounter: documentation, review, findings, and administrative action. Darius received notice of the outcome through the complaint process. He read it twice before setting it down. He had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, he felt relieved that the record no longer required him to prove what had happened. The facts had been separated from the assumptions, and the department had attached a consequence to the decisions that followed those assumptions. Still, Darius knew removing Caleb from patrol did not answer the question he cared about most. One officer could be disciplined, and the next uncertain call could still begin the same way. When he later spoke with the department representative handling the complaint outcome, he did not ask whether Caleb would lose his career. He did not ask for a harsher punishment or a public apology. He asked what would happen because of the finding. The representative began explaining the remaining administrative process, but Darius stopped him gently. "That is not what I mean. He thought about the neighbor who had said he did not know who Darius was, the tools that had become suspicious because of who was carrying them, and the verification that had always been available. Then he asked the question that shifted the case from punishment toward consequence. What changes after this? Darius's question changed the tone of the conversation. The department representative had been prepared to explain disciplinary procedure, but Darius was asking about what happened after discipline. The answer was narrower than a sweeping promise of reform, and Darius preferred it that way. Caleb would remain off street patrol while the administrative disposition was completed. The finding required additional training focused on de-escalation, investigative decision-making, and reassessing suspicion when new information contradicted an officer's initial interpretation. His eventual assignment would be determined through that process rather than by returning him immediately to the same patrol duties. The department also issued additional supervisory guidance for ambiguous suspicious activity calls. When an encounter began escalating beyond what a caller had actually reported, supervisors were expected to distinguish what officers had confirmed from what they were still assuming. It was a limited change, not a promise that another bad judgment could never happen, but it addressed the exact failure Darius had challenged. What mattered to him was that the department had identified the failure as more than a single bad moment with a taser. The problem had begun earlier, when uncertainty was repeatedly interpreted in only one direction. During a follow-up conversation, a department representative asked whether Darius wanted to submit an additional statement about the outcome. He thought about it before answering. "I do not need you to say officers should never investigate a suspicious call," he said. "If somebody calls, I expect you to check it out. But checking something out is supposed to help you learn what is true." He explained that every piece of new information that evening had offered Caleb an opportunity to reassess the situation. The work van, the work order, the homeowner, the caller's limited knowledge. None of those details had required Caleb to trust Darius blindly. They had required him to verify before treating suspicion as certainty. Darius did not ask to meet Caleb. He did not need an apology scene to make the complaint meaningful, and he did not want his life tied indefinitely to the officer's disciplinary process. When the conversation ended, he returned to the part of his life that had been interrupted. He returned to his customers and the ordinary rhythm of electrical work. For several days, he noticed himself becoming tense whenever a patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror. He disliked that reaction, partly because it made the encounter feel as though it still controlled him. So he concentrated on what he could control: his work, his decisions, and whether he allowed one evening to define every interaction that followed. The complaint had produced a finding. The finding had produced consequences for Caleb and a limited change in how similar encounters would be reviewed. That was enough for Darius to stop waiting for a more dramatic victory. A few weeks later, the homeowner from the Milwaukee renovation property contacted him about a small electrical follow-up that needed to be completed in the garage. Darius looked at the address on his schedule and hesitated. Then he accepted the job. On the appointed afternoon, he loaded his tools into the same work van and drove back to the house where the entire encounter had begun. When Darius turned onto the familiar Milwaukee street, the house looked almost exactly as it had a few weeks earlier. The renovation was farther along, but the driveway and garage were unchanged. He parked his work van, gathered the equipment he needed, and walked toward the garage. This time, no patrol car arrived behind him. The homeowner met him briefly, explained the electrical issue, and left him to work. Darius had been there less than 15 minutes when he noticed someone approaching from the neighboring property. He recognized the man as the neighbor who had made the original call. Darius set down his tester and waited. He had imagined this possibility before returning, but he had never decided what he would say. The neighbor stopped several feet away. "Darius?" he asked. Darius nodded. The man looked uncomfortable, but he did not begin with an excuse. "I have thought a lot about what I told dispatch that night," he said. "What I actually knew and what I only assumed." Darius remained quiet. "I kept thinking I had reported something happening," the neighbor continued. "But listening to myself, I realized I had not actually seen anything happen. I saw you come out of a garage with tools. I did not recognize you. That was what I knew." Darius watched him carefully. The neighbor looked toward the work van, and then back at him. "The dispatcher asked if you might be working here. I said I did not know. I have thought about that answer a lot." He paused. "I did not know who you were, but somehow I treated not knowing as a reason to suspect you. Darius appreciated that the man was not pretending the police response had been entirely his responsibility. Caleb had made his own decisions, and the department had already addressed them. But the call had been the first link in the chain, and the neighbors seemed to understand that now. "I am sorry," the man said. "Not because you turned out to have the right job, or because the homeowner confirmed your name. I should not have needed any of that to understand that I had not actually seen you commit a crime." Darius looked toward the garage, where he still had work waiting. He did not feel an obligation to comfort the man, and forgiveness was not something he wanted to perform simply because an apology had been offered. Still, the honesty mattered. "Next time," Darius said quietly, "find out before you decide." The neighbor nodded. "I will." There was nothing more that needed to be said. Darius returned to the garage. He tested the circuit, found the problem, replaced the faulty component, and verified that everything was working properly before packing his tools. The ordinary rhythm of the job felt more meaningful than any public recognition could have. He was not an undercover federal agent, a police chief, or someone with powerful connections. He was Darius Monroe, a residential electrician who had been standing exactly where his work required him to stand. For once, that simple fact felt like enough. When Darius finished, he closed the garage, placed his equipment in the same work van that had once been treated as part of the suspicion, and drove away without looking back. Sometimes the most dangerous distance is not between two people, but between what someone actually knows and what they become certain they know without checking. Perhaps assumptions become most powerful in the moments when nobody pauses long enough to notice that a possibility has quietly turned into a conclusion. There is something equally meaningful in the way Darius chose to move forward. He did not need revenge to prove that the experience mattered, and he did not need to pretend that an apology erased it. Sometimes accountability simply creates a chance for the next decision to be made differently. And perhaps dignity is easiest to understand when nothing extraordinary is required to earn it. No important title, no powerful connection, no hidden identity, just the recognition that an ordinary person deserves to be judged by what is actually known. If you had been in Darius's position, how would you have responded after returning to that house? And what do you think matters most when suspicion begins forming before the facts are clear?